Years ago, I worked with a woman who desperately wanted to save her marriage. At least that's what she said when she first arrived, and I believed her. She loved her husband, she loved her family, she loved the life she thought she had. But after a couple of sessions, something became increasingly clear. The marriage she thought she was trying to save no longer existed, and in many ways, in most ways actually, it had never existed. She had discovered years of deception, years of betrayal, years of realizing that the relationship she thought she was living in was not the relationship she had actually been living in. And underneath all of her efforts to save the marriage was a quieter truth she already knew. It was over. The truth wasn't hidden. It was simply too painful to live with yet. For a long time, she kept trying to figure out how to save her marriage, how to repair it, how to make sense of what had happened. And that made perfect sense to me. When something we love breaks, our first instinct is often to fix it. But eventually she reached a point where every question led back to the same place. Not how do I save this, but can I accept what is already true? And those are very different questions. She wasn't foolish. She wasn't avoiding reality. She was grieving. She had to grieve the marriage she thought she had. She had to grieve the future she had imagined. She had to grieve the story she had built her life around. And only then could she begin acting on what she already knew. That experience taught me something important. Many people think intuition is about getting answers. More often, intuition is about recognizing truths we're not yet ready to act on. Over the last several videos, we've talked about burnout, self-trust, insight, and change. And underneath all of those conversations is the same question. Can I stay connected to what I know when it becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or disruptive? Because that's usually where things become difficult. Not when intuition arrives, but when it asks something of us. I think intuition is one of the most misunderstood words in personal development. People often imagine intuition as something mysterious, a gift, a special ability, a way of predicting the future, a magic card trick. And certainly unusual things happen sometimes. But that's not primarily how I think about intuition. I think of intuition as discernment, attention, listening, and the ability to recognize what is true even when you wish it weren't, and the willingness to remain connected to that truth while deciding what to do about it. Sometimes it looks very ordinary, a tightening in your stomach every time a particular person's name appears on your phone, the relief you feel when plans get canceled, the conversation you've been rehearsing for 6 months, the job you keep trying to convince yourself you still love. The realization that you've been explaining something away for a very long time. The difficulty is not usually noticing these things. The difficulty is what happens next. Can you trust what you're noticing? Can you stay connected to it? Can you allow it to matter? Or do you immediately begin explaining it away, talking yourself out of it, or overriding it with what you think you should do? That's where discernment becomes important. Not simply recognizing something, but recognizing it, accepting it, and responding to it honestly. Sometimes intuition tells you that a relationship has changed, and sometimes it tells you that you're exhausted, that you've outgrown a job, that a boundary is needed, that the life you're trying so hard to maintain no longer fits the person you've become. None of those things are particularly magical. Most of them are deeply practical. The challenge is they often require courage, and that's where many people become stuck, because most people don't need help receiving more intuitive information. They need help living with it. They know they're exhausted, and they keep pushing. They know a conversation needs to happen, and they keep postponing it. They know they're carrying emotions that don't belong to them, and they keep carrying them. They know a decision has already been made somewhere inside them, and they continue arguing with it. This is one of the reasons I become increasingly interested in integration. Information is important. It's just not the whole story. I teach courses because I'm a teacher, and I believe learning matters, understanding matters, language matters. When people understand how intuition actually works, many things begin making sense. Experiences that once felt confusing become recognizable. Patterns become easier to identify. People stop assuming they're broken. That's valuable. But understanding intuition and integrating intuition aren't the same thing. Integration happens in the middle of an actual life, while you're navigating a different relationship, while you're deciding whether to stay or leave, while you're recovering from burnout, while you're learning to distinguish between fear, intuition, anxiety, obligation, emotional absorption, and genuine discernment. And that work is rarely theoretical. A few years ago, I started noticing something interesting. People would come to me with very different situations. One person was trying to decide whether to leave a relationship she had emotionally outgrown years earlier. Someone else knew they were finished with a career but couldn't imagine who they would be without it. Someone else was so accustomed to carrying other people's emotions that they no longer knew which feelings belonged to them. The circumstances were different, but underneath them, I kept finding the same question. Can I trust what I know? Not what other people think or what I should do, not what makes sense on paper. Can I trust what I'm actually perceiving? That's what eventually led me to create this mentorship. I wanted a place where people could work with intuition as a lived practice rather than an interesting concept. Not as a general life support container, not as a place where people bring every possible problem, but as a focused space to work with intuition directly, to understand how it actually shows up, to notice where it gets overridden, to distinguish it from fear, anxiety, obligation, and wishful thinking, and to learn what it feels like to trust more consistently. One person realizes they've spent years dismissing body intuition because they trust analysis more than sensation. Another discovers that what they've been calling intuition is actually anxiety, while the quieter signal underneath it has been accurate all along. Someone else begins noticing that much of the overwhelm they're carrying doesn't belong to them in the first place. And sometimes the work is much simpler. A decision that has been waiting patiently in the background for months or years finally becomes impossible to ignore. The details vary. The underlying work is remarkably similar. We're looking at how intuition naturally shows up, what interferes with it, where it becomes distorted or overridden, and how to build enough trust that it can become something you actually use rather than something you occasionally notice. I should also say something about who this work is for. For many years, people often arrived in my work during a crisis. And while I was glad to help, I began noticing something. Once the immediate emergency had passed, the deeper patterns were still there. Second-guessing, self-abandonment, the inability to trust themselves, the habit of overriding what they knew. So eventually, I became more interested in helping people build something sustainable than helping them survive another emergency. That's who this mentorship is designed for. People who are ready to practice trusting themselves. People who are willing to look honestly at their patterns. People who want more than reassurance. Because discernment is different. Discernment doesn't always tell us what we want to hear. It doesn't always make life easier, but it does make life clearer. And clarity changes things. Not all at once, gradually, the way we explored in the previous video. A decision made a little sooner, a boundary held a little more consistently, a feeling acknowledged instead of explained away, a growing ability to trust yourself in situations where you once would have abandoned yourself. These changes seem small when they begin, but over time they alter the direction of a life. If you've watched this entire series, you've probably noticed that the same themes keep returning. Burnout, self-trust, insight, change, discernment, the cost of overriding yourself, the importance of paying attention, the small decisions that gradually shape a life. That's the work we do inside the mentorship. Not because I have your answers, I don't. And I'm not interested in becoming the person who makes your decisions for you. The best mentoring relationships eventually make themselves less necessary. So the goal is not dependence. The goal is the opposite. The goal is helping you develop a relationship with yourself that becomes increasingly trustworthy. Because intuition isn't about certainty. It isn't about prediction. It isn't about control. It's about learning how to hear yourself clearly, trust what you hear, and move through the world with greater steadiness. And in my experience, that's a skill that changes far more than people expect.